Hi, welcome to the Get Ready with God podcast. My name is Julie Taylor, and I'm your host. And I am not God. Obviously, I'm not even an expert. I'm not a scriptorian. I'm literally just a girl sitting in front of a microphone, hoping God is real. The Get Ready with God podcast is the daily devotional podcast to help you see divinity in every day. Okay, you know that saying that's like, "What would you do if you knew you could not fail?" And that's supposed to be all inspirational, of like, "Oh wow, I have such a fear of failure." I didn't resonate with that. I've done a lot of things in life that have failed. I have failed at a lot of things. I have quit a lot of things, and I'm actually usually not that phased by it. And so I've always just kind of been like, I don't know, I'd probably still just do whatever I wanted. But then I got really specific on like, what does failure feel like? What's holding me back? But the question I want to ask you today, first of all, explore that. What does failure feel like to you? Only because I think then you can get really specific on what's still holding you back, and it might surprise you. I'm always surprised when I learn like what's holding me back because I think I'm so evolved and I've made so much progress. I have made a lot of progress, but I'm still pretty controlled by certain fears. So that's an interesting exercise. Ask God to show you. That's always fun. It's always fun to ask God to teach you about yourself, brace yourself. But that's a fun exercise. But the question that I want to ask you today is, what would you do if you didn't have to convince anyone of anything? Maybe this won't be relatable. I truly don't know how universal this is, but I, for a long time, felt like convincing people of things was important. And I think part of that comes from always wanting to be understood. Like, you don't want to, it's not fun when you're misunderstood. So you want to convince people of certain things. Part of it came for me from not being who I wanted to be and how I wanted to be. So I was really obsessed with controlling people's perception of me in my early married days, early motherhood days, more like. And I had really severe postpartum depression and I was not okay, but I really didn't want anyone to know that. And so my reality versus how I was trying to portray myself there was a big discrepancy there. I put a lot of my effort into convincing people that I was a certain way, even little things like that my house was always clean, or I want to be a person who's perceived as eating healthy, even that, like, down to photographs. Like, I had a lot of body image struggles. And so when a photograph was taken of me or shared where I didn't look good, I would have a full come apart, like call my friends crying and ask them to untag me on Facebook or to take a picture down. Really wild times, man. I have a lot of compassion for that phase of life. Anyways, so there was that phase where I would have to convince people of things because the reality was different than I wanted the perception to be. And so I would try to put on an act and convince people of things. There's been a lot of phases in my life where I have felt pressured in one way or another, where I felt like it's my job and I feel pressured to convince people of things. And I have caved to that pressure and I've internalized that pressure and I've taken actions that are maybe not aligned with my values to soothe that pressure that I feel. And in the last few years, I've really rebelled against that idea. And I've just kind of leaned into, I don't have to convince anyone of anything. I don't have to convince people that I'm good. I don't have to convince people that I'm smart. I don't have to convince people that I'm funny. I don't have to convince people that I'm hot. I don't have to convince people that I'm a good mom. I don't have to convince people that I have strong enough faith. I don't have to convince people that even though I'm in faith, I'm still a good person. I don't have to convince people that even though I was out of faith, I'm still a good person. Do you see where I'm going? If you're going to appease everyone, you can't. It all directly contradicts people, like contradicts itself. Let's say believing in God, for example. My choice to believe in God and my choice to share faith, that very same thing makes half the people angry and judge me, and that makes other half of people love me, and vice versa. Like, it all is just an impossible matrix of doom and hell. And so I just have opted out. And what would I do if I didn't have to convince anyone of anything? I would choose what I actually want to choose, first of all. And I would have more capacity to choose it and to do it because I wouldn't be spending my time and energy and capacity defending myself and convincing people of anything. And since I've kind of started this process a few years ago, I've just been thinking a lot about it, about how we don't have to prove ourselves, but also we don't have to convince anyone of anything. And when that factor is removed, if you could choose faith and you don't have to convince anyone on either side of the argument that what you're choosing is good or okay, what would you actually choose? Because I think sometimes the pressure of having to defend ourselves or having to convince people of things is so great that we actually change our choice to accommodate that effort. One of the reasons that I was so scared to share my faith publicly is because I didn't want to have to defend it, because there's a lot of things that I can't defend. And I was like, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to have to defend my choices. Not because they're bad, unethical choices or something, but just because they're personal to me, they're vulnerable to me, or I don't have it all figured out. So I don't know how to defend certain things. And some things happen that I'm just like, yeah, I can't defend that. And so what will people think is still a controlling factor to me. I wish it weren't. I wish that I was more evolved and I've come a long way, but it's still kind of a factor for me often. But I just want to ask you that question. What would you do if you didn't have to convince anyone? I just think there's a lot of pressure, and that pressure to explain ourselves to people is often what puts the pressure on ourselves to figure it out. And there's a path that I'd like to offer you where you don't have to figure it out and you don't have to know. The only reason you really need to know something is if you need to defend it or convince people of things. And that pressure is real. And so, what if you took that pressure off for a minute and told yourself that you don't have to know anything because you don't have to convince anyone of anything and you don't have to prove anything about faith or otherwise? What would you do? What would you believe? What would you choose if you didn't have to convince anyone of it and if you didn't have to defend it? Oftentimes in these situations, ethical questions arise of like, what's the ethical correct thing to do? And that obviously deserves examination. And so I'm not just saying like we get to do whatever we want. We don't have to explain ourselves and who cares. And we don't have to answer to anyone. I think we do have to answer to our own integrity. And so in these situations, I think values and integrity should definitely be used and follow what needs to be done to stay in line there with your own values and ethics. But when it comes to controlling perception, proving yourself to someone, controlling how someone thinks of you, being good enough for someone, being taken seriously, being seen as the good guy, people seeing your side of the story, things being fair, all of those motivations, toss them out the window. Who cares? Who cares? You want to use your energy, your precious attention capacity and energy on that? Nah. You're better than that. You're bigger than that. And you're meant for bigger things than that. And you have things that you need to do, and they demand a lot from you. And those things are what are worthy of your precious, precious soul. So spend time there. You don't have to convince anyone of anything. You know, another thing I don't have to convince you of is that smoking looks cool. Okay. I wish I was a smoker. Smoking looks cool. That's how I feel. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Love you so much. Bye.